Hey everyone, I'm Kevin with Victory 4x4. In today's video, we're going to be installing a roof rack on this 2023 Chevy Colorado. So right here we have kind of everything you should receive from us when you place your order. You've got hardware, mounting brackets, both side rails. You're going to have roof rack crossbars as well as front and rear fairings. We're going to start out by getting this rack assembled, which will begin with the 2 side rails and actually just 3 of the 5 crossbars. So we'll set some of this other stuff to the side and get started. So the side rails are not side specific. It doesn't matter which one you grab to get started. We're going to be bolting our crossbars into the horizontal slots along the top edge you see here. So I'll start out just in the center with the side rail and 1 crossbar. When you grab these, you'll want to pay attention. You're going to be looking for the slots that you see here. Those are milled into one end. Typically we put them towards the driver's side, but having them all consistent is really the key factor there. And then you'll kind of line up the 2. Now as you're getting these lined up, you can kind of see those cutouts a little bit closer here. I don't think I mentioned those are for the T-nuts that we mount accessories to these rails with. And then you're now going to want to find the 3/4 long, 1/4 button head bolts along with washers in your hardware pack. This is the most common bolt in there, and that's what we're going to use to bolt these 2 together. So go ahead and line them up and get those started. We do recommend using anti-seize on all of these, which you may see a little bit of residue here. We kind of already put that on this one off camera. With both of your bolts started, you'll find a 5/32 Allen T-handle or hex driver, whatever you have available. And then typically we just center these up in the slot to start and snug them in place. You will likely have to change the position of this later on if you're mounting any accessories to the rack. So from there, all of those crossbars are going to install in that exact same fashion. We're going to be putting one on either side of this center one, leaving both the front and rear open. The reason for that is just so we have more access to the mounts during the remainder of the install. With the 3 crossbars in, it should look something like you see here, and then you'll just repeat that process over on this side with the passenger side rail, and we can continue on with the front and rear fairings. As you move into the fairings, you're also going to want to find the provided edge lock trim. This is going to go kind of like you see here all the way along the front edge on this front fairing. Basically, you're just trying to cover kind of the main front radius or from point to point where this transitions like you see here. And this just presses right on to this edge and kind of has a little bit of tension built into it. You will have to cut this, so you'll have the full front edge that you kind of cover up and cut off the excess, which will leave you with about a 10 to 12 inch piece like you see here. This is going to go on the bottom edge of the rear fairing right in the center. So I'm just going to kind of eyeball this for now, and we can adjust it later if needed. But you just kind of start one end and then work your way across, pressing that into place.
Like it is.
So the install for the front and rear fairings is pretty much identical. The only real difference will be the rear fairing only has 2 bolts per side where the front has 3. This is going to install with that edge lock trim down. That's what's going to pretty much contact the roof of the vehicle, seal off any air gap, prevent any kind of movement or rattle, as well as any damage over time. Then we'll kind of lay it into position like this with that bent flange on top, angled toward the back. I'll quick kind of install 1 bolt loosely over here just to help support this side. And then we can install the 3 bolts down here. Now these again are the 3/4 long, 1/4 button heads with washers, just like we were using in those crossbars. So you can kind of line that up and install the bolt. The only real difference here is on the back side, you're now installing the serrated flange nuts. That again, you'll find in that hardware pack. This is going to get kind of fine-tuned or adjusted later on in the install. So for now, we're just getting all the hardware in, and we'll snug 1 or 2 up just to hold this in place and prevent it from moving for now. So with those snugged up, you can just go repeat that process to get that rear fairing installed. Now we can install our mounts to the roof rack side rails. So we'll start off with the rear mounts that you see here. These are not side specific, they're symmetric mounts, so they can go on either side. The slotted holes are going to bolt out to the side rail, leaving the round holes and part number to go down against the roof of the vehicle. And you're bolting these in with more of those 1/4 button heads with washers and flange locking nuts. As for the front ones, they are side specific. They're shown here in the correct orientation, so driver, passenger. Again, slotted holes out to the side, round holes down, and you can kind of see then you've got a forward facing arrow here, and the mount kind of steps back and down toward the roof. So moving in here, this is the passenger front mount, for example. So I will pass those bolts through the round holes in the side rail, slide the mount on, and install the nuts in here. And then with that 5/32 T-handle, we'll just lightly snug this up for now. And again, we'll need to adjust that once we're up on the roof. Then, so you can see it, we'll throw a rear mount on here, again on the passenger side. Same process, same hardware. So we'll get this in place, and then we can jump over to the other side and kind of repeat this with the brackets over there to get all 4 mounts installed. Once you have all 4 mounts bolted to your rack, the rack is ready to come up here on the roof of the truck. However, we have to get these kind of black trim sections you see here removed before it can go in place. Reason for that is we're going to be bolting and drilling down into this kind of rain channel section. So we do want to try and save these, as it can be cut and modified and a small piece of it put back in both front and rear to kind of clean up the look of this at the very end of your install. The way these are held on, there's kind of some little metal pins sticking out of the roof, and then some plastic clips in this section that you got to kind of get to free up and pop off of those pins. So ideally you're going to want a plastic style trim tool like I have here, something that's not going to damage the painted roof surface. And then you're going to be working to get underneath that as close to the pins as possible, and then kind of lifting and sort of pushing to one side and then back to the other. It's a little bit of a weird motion, but that lets you free up those plastic clips, pop it off of the pin, and then it's just a matter of working the rest of the way down to pop all of the clips free and get this lifted off of the roof. So this is the complete trim section removed. What I did have happen was one of the plastic clips popped out of there and is still stuck on the pin here on the roof. So if that happens, you really just kind of push it to the side, lift up on, in my case, that inside edge, and then it should just pop right off of the pin, and then it can be clipped back into here. With that removed, I'll just go do the same thing on the other side, and then we can move to getting the rack installed up here. Now, to get your assembled rack up here, you just want to be sure to grab at least one friend, and you'll typically just carry it over the front of the vehicle and place it down here on the roof, making sure that the mounts nest down into that channel we talked about earlier. As you set it down in here, you're going to be looking for the second pin from the front. The first one is kind of way up here under your front fairing, and you're going to place the front edge of this front mount against the back edge of that pin, and that is what's going to locate the rack and the holes you're going to drill from front to rear on the roof of the truck. While you're pushing the rack forward against the back of that pin, you can then take a marker, ideally something you can see on your specific paint color. I just have a gold one here, and then you're just going to go down inside of each of the round holes on your mounts and make a nice mark. Do that on all 4 mounts. Once you get that marked out on all 4 mounting locations, you're going to want to now remove the rack one time so that we can access those locations for drilling and Rivnut installation. With the rack out of the way, what we're going to do is drill out these holes and install the provided Rivnuts. So as always, to drill a decent hole, you want to start with a good center punch. So we'll go to the center of each mark and do that. And then with those marked out, we're going to need to drill our holes out to insert the Rivnuts into the roof here. So as you can kind of see on pretty much all the drill bits I have here, we're using drill stops. The reason for that is you do still have a headliner and everything down inside of this vehicle, and if you don't want to take that out, which we're trying to prevent you from having to do that, you're going to want these so that you don't over drill and damage anything down there. So if you've never used these before, they just slide onto the drill bit. They have a small set screw on the side so you can set the depth that you're drilling, and you can start out like I have here with probably 3/16. If that's not enough, you can always make small adjustments to this to make sure you're getting through all of the sheet metal on the roof, but again, not over drilling into any other materials down there. So while we do provide you with the correct size bit to get your Rivnuts inserted here, you're not gonna wanna start with that bit. You're gonna wanna start with a smaller size like the 1/8 inch bit I have here. We'll be using that as a pilot and then stepping up to, I believe this is either 1/4 or 3/16, and then finishing those holes off with the bit we provide. So from here, just take your time, be as cautious and careful as you feel you need to be with your given skill set. Also, we do recommend grabbing a vacuum just to make sure you're not dropping a bunch of metal shavings down in on top of your headliner. I'm not too worried about that with just this 1/8 inch bit, making our first initial hole into the roof, as most of those shavings are gonna wind up right up here. But when we step into the larger hole sizes, I will grab that to clean all of that up. As I move into my 1/4 inch bit here, some of you might wonder what this blue tape is about. I'm just trying to be extra cautious here, mainly because the components underneath this that you could damage if you were to over drill are things like airbags, wire harnesses for your sunroof, even the drain for your sunroof and things like that. So not to try and scare you away from those things, but I have had drill stops come loose occasionally as well. So check them frequently, and then that's just, again, a roll of tape to kind of back that up and prevent it from slipping up on the bit. So we'll just step up to our next size and continue drilling. Then as I switch to my larger drill bit to finish things up, I kind of got the same thing. It's a drill stop, a tape backstop that I added here, and then I'm just going to stop frequently to clean that up with a vacuum. Once you get to a point where you have those holes drilled out, you'll now need to assemble your Rivnut installation tool. So start off by finding one at least of your M6 Rivnuts that we provide. You're then going to need to find a small star washer, a flat washer, this high hex nut, another flat washer, and this M6 hex bolt. So you'll assemble that kind of in the reverse of how I just took it apart. Flat washer, high nut, flat washer, star washer, and then you can install your first Rivnut on there, and you wind up with something like that. You can then use that assembly to check that your hole size is accurate and that those are able to be installed. A little bit snug isn't a problem. That's actually a good thing. You, however, do not want these to be too loose so that this can compress in that hole and grip that roof sheet metal. Now, one thing I did notice, and you guys may run into this as well, when you're installing the Rivnut into the hole, there is a little bit of sealant down on this outside edge of this channel. You want to make sure that the Rivnut has enough space to sit nice and flat on the sheet metal with its kind of top flange, if you will, right here. So I am going to cut just a little bit of that out. I'm just going to use a razor blade, and I have a real small scraper and a pick here. We're not taking much out, just enough that that can sit nice and flat. Now, to this point, we've only really talked about the tool we provide to get these installed. There's a couple different ways you could do it as well if you wanted to spend a little money on an aftermarket Rivnut install tool like the one I have here. These are available all over the internet. Basically, they do the same thing as our tool in a slightly more controlled method, if you will. You thread the Rivnut on the end down here. You stick this hex end in a drill, insert it into the hole just like our tool, and then use a drill to power this end and compress the Rivnut into place. You can do a similar thing with a drill and a socket driver and a socket in this fashion, and then use our tool, hold a wrench, and drive the bolt through the center with the drill that way. Or kind of the most controlled method that may be just a little bit slower is going to be to use a 13mm wrench on the nut here on our tool and a 10mm socket on a ratchet, and slowly install them this way. That way you can just feel it as you're compressing those and kind of get a better idea when to stop and know that they're nice and seated tight against that material. Regardless of the method you choose, before these go in, you want to put a little bit of sealant on them. We're just using a Permatex Ultra Black gasket maker. That's what we're going to use to seal the mounts to the roof with as well. You're just going to put a kind of thin bead around here to seal this up and prevent any water intrusion, if you will, to help prevent corrosion over time as well. And then you can insert that, and using kind of your chosen method for the Rivnut installation, go ahead and start installing those. So you really should be able to feel these as they start to tighten up. At that point, you're going to kind of have to use your discretion to not over tighten them. These are just kind of small M6 threads after all. But it becomes pretty obvious. Obviously, when your ratchet's not going to turn anymore, you can always back this out, take a look at it physically, kind of down inside to make sure it looks compressed against that material, and tighten a little more if needed. And you will then remove the tool, install a new Rivnut onto here, and then repeat that process for all the remaining holes for each mount. So real quick, we did move to the driver's side rear corner now instead of up front, mostly because that gave us just a better angle to show you what's going on here, but it also gives you just a quick look at what this area will look like once you have both of the rear Rivnuts installed. At this point, you can find the M6 button head bolts in your bolt pack. They're going to look very similar to the 1/4 bolts you've been using so far. However, they are just a little bit longer and they're a finer thread, so they should be pretty easy to identify. And along with those, you'll want the slightly oversized M8 washers to go with them. And then we can grab our roof rack, set it back in place just like you had it before during that marking process, and we can work towards getting it bolted on. With your rack back up here on the roof, you can then remove the mount in the corner you're working on. And once you get this out of the way, we're going to be applying more sealant to this location and then simply reinstalling the mount. Just to prevent any damage to the truck at all, I did put a rag or microfiber, in this case, underneath this back corner to help support the rack. And then basically what you're going to do is come in here and apply a generous amount of RTV around each of these holes. All of this should be pretty hidden, so you don't have to worry too much about making a mess. I'm actually going to put a line along the center as well to kind of help seal this, and then it does act as a little bit of an adhesive to hold the mount down to the roof. So carefully line this up and place it back in here. You can then loosely reinstall the mounting hardware to the side rail. With that in place, you'll then take your RTV and add a little more sealant, basically closing in the tops of these holes, kind of to help seal the bolt head and washer up top, as well as to force the bolt threads to pass through some sealant on the way in. Then taking one of those M6 button heads with the washer, you can carefully get these started. For these, you'll want a 4mm hex, and just as you're tightening them down, make sure you're pushing the rack again towards that pin up front that we used for locating earlier on. And you can snug both of these in place. So as you get that tight, you can see obviously some of that RTV kind of squishes out of the sides, out from under the bolt heads. You can tidy some of that up and try and clean it up if you would like. What I found more often than not is I wind up making more of a mess doing that than just leaving it. And again, this is a pretty hidden location once everything is fully installed, so no worries there. At this point, we're actually going to leave this side rail mounting hardware just a little bit loose, basically finger tight right now, because we'll use that for our height adjustment once all 4 of our mounts are bolted down. You can then repeat that process on the remaining 3 mounts and then go back and install those 2 crossbars that we left out for access to these locations. Once you get all of those mounts tight, those crossbars reinstalled, you'll come down and kind of take a step back on the side, taking a look at the gap or line between the bottom edge of this side rail and the top of your roof. Basically what you want to do here is just get it parallel where it looks good visually, but also ideally you'll bring it down pretty much as close as possible to the roof. You shouldn't be able to adjust it much lower than about 1/4 of an inch. And then depending on the weight of the accessories you're installing, you'll want to pay attention to that kind of under dynamic load situations and make sure that this can't deflect at all and move and damage the top of this roof. So once you're happy with your gap, ours looks pretty good here. I might pick up the front ever so slightly. You'll take your 5/32 hex and tighten the hardware holding the side rail to the mounts on the roof. Once you've got that adjusted and tight to both mounts over here, you'll repeat that process over on the other side, and then we can move to adjusting the front and rear fairings. The fairing adjustment itself is pretty straightforward. You've got the 3 mounting bolts on the side and 3 slots in the fairing. So with those loose, you can adjust it up and down. Basically what you're trying to do here is press it down tight to the roof to kind of seal this off, prevent any wind noise through there, but also any rattling in the fairing. So you'll push that down, make sure it's kind of even from side to side, and then snug these up. Now before you go crazy getting these all tight on both sides, we also recommend picking up some paint protection film to kind of apply and install on the painted roof surface here. Basically anywhere that this edge trim is going to contact the paint. That's going to do a couple things for you, but mainly it's to prevent that painted surface over time, as any small fine kind of dust, dirt, and debris can work their way into there, and with minor vibration and movement of the rack kind of rub that paint off. So we'll give you a quick overview of how this installs. Generally speaking, I start out with some masking tape. I lay this out on the edge of the paint about 1/4 of an inch in front of the forwardmost edge of this trim. I'll do this all the way across. Once you have the tape all the way across, I usually just take a marker and look for the spot where the seal kind of stops contacting the roof. In this case, we're pretty much going to go just right out to the end of our tape and bring that film basically right out to the edge of there and the windshield right here. So from there, you'll remove the front 2 bolts on your fairing. You could technically just remove the entire fairing if that seems easier to you, but we're just going to remove the front 2 bolts and then kind of pivot it back up and out of the way. Obviously, I already removed those over on the other side. From here, I've just got some alcohol prep pads. If you have just a microfiber and a bottle of isopropyl alcohol, that will work just the same. All we're looking to do is get any sort of residue or anything off of the paint here where we're going to be installing our paint protection film. So go ahead and clean that up. So the stuff I have here is from 3M. I'm sure there's multiple companies offering similar products that work just fine. So go ahead and order and pick up whatever you prefer. You can see also that it's available in multiple lengths. The 2-inch that I have here is just kind of easier to work with in terms of making sure you get nice coverage under the full portion of that seal where it might contact the roof. If you can do it accurate enough, this 1-inch, I think it winds up actually being more like 7/8, is just kind of a little cleaner and more discreet, but again, it's transparent. It's not going to be super noticeable, as it is also covered up by the fairing once fully installed. So once you have that, you just kind of start by peeling back one edge. I've also just got a vinyl applicator. You can pick these up all over the internet as well, pretty cheap. That's what we're going to be using to kind of press it down tight on the roof. And then using our tape as a guide, we'll just start this side. And work our way across, following that tape as close as possible. So that part's pretty straightforward. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to try and cut this specifically to length before you get started, so we're just kind of working off of our roll here, and then you can cut it with a decent pair of scissors as you get to the other end. The only reason you wouldn't want to do that at the start is this does kind of stretch just a little bit as you're laying it down on the roof, and by the time you get to the other end, you'll probably have 1.5 inches or 1 inch or so left over that would need to be cut anyway. So once you get that installed all the way across, you can just peel your tape out of the way. You'll flip this back into place, reinstall that hardware, and again, just press it down tight to the roof before tightening everything up. With everything tidied up there, something you can do to kind of clean up and finish up this look is cut a 9.5 inch piece off of that factory trim that we removed earlier on during the install. And this is just going to clip back into the pins here on the roof. Since this front piece is only going to use one pin, we also added some double-sided tape back here to hopefully help secure that in place. And then you'll just slip it back into position underneath the front fairing here, get it lined up, make sure you're getting it back in behind the window seal there, and then just snap it down into position. Then moving to the rear, you can then do basically the same thing. Back here, you kind of have this keyhole slotted tab down on the bottom, and then one that snaps in up on top of the roof as well. So you shouldn't really need any adhesive back here, but you can go ahead and lock in the back and then click this in place. Then as far as the rear fairing goes back here, you're essentially using the same process with those slots on the side and your paint protection film behind the edge trim. The only real difference is that we don't have edge trim running all the way across the back fairing. So basically this comes down and rests right on the top edge of this third brake light. However, it can contact the paint just behind there as well. So cut yourself a short piece of this and put it kind of right down tight to the top edge of the light and wrap it over the radius of this roof, and it should achieve essentially the same thing there. Once you have things finished up there in the rear, technically you could trim that center section as well and take about 4 inches off of each side and snap that in. But again, that can't really be seen from here, so not really a requirement. From there, go ahead and just run back through and double check that everything's tight and your install is complete. So if you have any questions at all about this roof rack install or anything else we offer here at Victory 4x4, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always email us at info@victory4x4.com or call us at 269-459-8447.